And they were like,
Welcome back to the Responsible Conduct of Research seminar series. Our speaker today is Dr. Bruce Bunnell. He's going to be speaking on research misconduct and how research misconduct allegations are handled. Dr. Bunnell holds a BS from Purdue. He has a PhD from the University of Alabama at Birmingham in microbiology, specifically molecular genetics. He did postdocs at Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and he did one in pharmaceutical research at Parke-Davis Warner Lambert. At Tulane, he is a director of the Stem Cell Research and Regenerative Medicine Center and is also a professor in the Department of Pharmacology. Before joining Tulane, he was an assistant professor at Ohio State. As I was preparing Dr. Bunnell's intro today, he sent me his CV. It's 65 pages long. So clearly I couldn't read you all that. Among the highlights are his list of peer-reviewed publications. They start in 1986, which I am guessing is maybe longer than many people in this room have been alive. He has 150 peer-reviewed publications. He has served on many grant review panels and study sections and has traveled all over the world speaking about regenerative medicine. He holds 8 patents and currently serves on the editorial board of 7 journals. So I said, Dr. Bunnell, you're so busy. Do you have any free time? He said, yes. In his free time, he is the grandfather to 2 new granddaughters, and he also runs marathons. So, Dr. Bunnell, we are really looking forward to hearing what you have to tell us about research misconduct.
A topic I know well. Not from personal experience, but a topic I know well. All right, so Lisa said, my hobby is running marathons, and it's a good thing for an introvert. Gives you a lot of alone time, and it's a good thing for a scientist because it gives you a lot of time to think about experiments and where your research is going. So today we're going to talk about research misconduct, and we're going to, my slides come up. We're going to start off with a pop quiz, not graded, but just a pop quiz. Oh, and the other thing I should say is feel free to ask questions, make comments. I'd rather have this be interactive than me just droning on. So essentially we're going to do, it wasn't an interactive poll, but I didn't want to bring out all the stuff this year. So we're going to get your views on research misconduct for 3 real-world cases. So a faculty member at the University of Vermont College of Medicine admits to falsifying data in 17 grant applications to the NIH and fabricating data in 10 publications over a period of 10 years. Is that considered research misconduct? Yeah, that was pretty obvious, right? I mean, we're all, some of you I'm sure are very early in your graduate careers, but everybody should know this. It's not a good thing to do. But it actually did happen. So the scientist's name was Dr. Eric Pullman. He was banned forever from seeking or receiving public research money. That would be like NIH, NSF money, any tax-funded research. I don't know who that was, but Eric Pullman speaking to me from across the. So in addition to that, he had to retract 10 scientific papers and a prison sentence of 1 year and 1 day for falsifying data in a grant application. And he had to pay the government back $180,000. So there can be very severe and very harsh consequences to performing research misconduct. So go ahead.
Dr. Eric Pullman was the first person that actually got sentenced to jail time for research misconduct.
Yes.
But he wasn't the last. Like that started something that has continued.
So I will say, really nobody cared much about research misconduct, or it wasn't discussed publicly until really the 80s. But the sentences are getting very, very, very harsh. Question number 2. Faculty member provides hypothesis regarding visual working memory research, and a student conducts experiments funded by the National Institutes of Mental Health. Student obtains results that are in line with the hypothesis. The data also contains outliers. Student just removes the outliers. The research is eventually published. Is this research misconduct? It depends?
Yeah.
What does it depend on?
Can you, statistically, are you able to remove the outliers? Like, are they actually outliers that aren't relevant to your data? Because there's some you can remove and some you think are outliers that are actually part of the data.
We might have to talk after class. So David Anderson, the graduate student at University of Oregon, Eugene, was found to have engaged in research misconduct. 4 papers were retracted and or corrected.
I think that's a good question. Though. Like what would be appropriate to remove and take out?
Depends on the field of research, but really, if it's a study like this where it's kind of more clinical based, you really shouldn't take out anything because you're asking people their thoughts and their opinions and studying memory research. And so you really shouldn't be taking out anything because there's always going to be outliers, especially in human subject research. Now, maybe if you do something in a laboratory where we're using inbred strains of mice, they're all pretty homogeneous. So, but with human subjects, it's always going to be variable, always. So no matter how many human subjects you test, there are always going to be outliers. And some, believe it or not, some of those outliers are where the interesting questions are. Why didn't they perform like everybody else? But everybody just like, well, it doesn't fit my preconceived hypothesis, so I don't care about the outliers. But really, sometimes that's where the interesting questions are scientifically, is not so much everybody fit my preconceived hypothesis, but what's really interesting about the ones that don't. Why don't they? Question 3, researcher conducted experiments for specific protein expressions in human-induced neuronal-derived skin fibroblasts of Alzheimer's disease patients and unaffected individuals. The researcher inflated the sample size of the quantitative data in some bar graphs in an unpublished manuscript. What do you think? Research misconduct?
Yes.
Why do you say yes? Somebody say yes. So be brave. Offer your opinion.
Determines your significance of space, so changes significance.
I agree. But it's not published, so does that matter?
But
No,
when
it
you go
doesn't
back
matter.
to your data to look at stuff, you're going to have the wrong stuff written down. Like if you ever need to go back and look at it.
Sure. It is research misconduct. So it doesn't necessarily have to be published, be research misconduct. And that was the point of that question, is a lot of people think, well, if it's not published, I didn't do anything wrong. If it's in a grant application, but I never published a paper, I didn't do anything wrong. But you did do something. So this postdoc at Columbia University was barred from federal grant funding for 3 years and could not be a grant reviewer for the same amount of time. So it's not limited to just published manuscripts. Misconduct was inflating the sample size and reporting it as part of the research results. So you can see there are some really obvious things that are research misconduct, and there are some things that are a little bit more nebulous.
And that is, a lot of people are, or maybe are have the wrong,
Yes.
wrong answer here. Like
Yes.
that they would think that if it's just in the lab and it's
Yes.
not published, it's not research misconduct.
Correct.
But that's been, there are a number of cases where that has occurred, and that's been clearly established. So
Correct.
if you take anything from this class, please remember that, please.
Yes, there are many people in my generation and older generations that believe if it's not published, it's not research misconduct, but that's not true. So this is what we're trying to avoid. I found this little picture on the internet. My first fraud kit performed decades of scientific fraud, no experimentation necessary. And sadly, there are people out there that must have this kit because it happens over and over and over again. And so what we're going to do today is talk about why it happens and how to prevent it. And if you are in a laboratory where it's happening, what you can do about it. So we're going to introduce the concept and issues surrounding research misconduct, review case studies on research misconduct allegations. They'll be similar to what our pop quiz was about. And to better understand the regulations and Tulane University policies and procedures applicable to research misconduct. So one of the reasons, there are 2 reasons I like giving this lecture. One is because Brian and Lisa are always here. So if you have a question that I can't answer, they can always answer it for me. So I don't have to look too foolish because they're going to answer it for me. And then secondly, it's my personal opinion that as a scientist, this is probably in the top 2 worst things you can do. You can ruin your career by doing it. Whether you do it as a graduate student, a postdoc, or a faculty member, you can ruin your scientific future by doing this. We're going to go through, we already showed some cases, but we're going to go through additional cases where people's lives have been ruined, changed forever because of their desire to do this. So prior to World War II, little public funding for research existed. So people didn't really care about it. But today, about half of all basic research is funded by your tax dollars. Maybe not your tax dollars for those of you that are graduate students because you don't pay a lot, but your parents' tax dollars, my tax dollars, Brian's tax dollars, Lisa's tax dollars. Some of our federal taxes go to the National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, Department of Defense, Some of your PIs probably have grants from some of these entities. I know I have grants from some of these entities. So as the public funding has grown, people have a right to know what their money is being spent on and whether it's being spent appropriately and it's being managed ethically. So there's been interest by the public through its elected officials, and that has resulted in increased regulation and oversight of research. And we're talking all kinds of research, from clinical research to basic science research in all fields. So as I said earlier, the really interest in misconduct initially arose in the 80s. At that time, research institutions either ignored it, covered it up, maybe went to the office as a faculty member and said, you shouldn't do that anymore. And he'd say, fine, I'm not doing that anymore. But in December of 2000, the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy adopted a federal policy on research misconduct. So this is policies on research misconduct. You can see the Federal Register number there. And essentially, it states that all institutions receiving public health service funding must have written policies and procedures for handling allegations of research misconduct. Covers any entity that applies for research training, or research-related grant or cooperative agreement with the public health service. So this would be things like the National Institutes of Health, NSF. So you have to establish definitions for research misconduct, outline procedures for reporting and investigating misconduct, and most importantly, provide protection for whistleblowers and persons accused of misconduct. So the protection is not necessarily only for the person that identified the problem and alerted the institution, but also the person accused has some rights and some protection. So the policy requires a designation of an individual authorized to receive and investigate allegations of misconduct, and that's called the Research Integrity Officer. And here at Tulane, that's Laura Levy. She's the Vice President for Research, and all of this percolates up to her responsibility. And Brian and Lisa both essentially report to her, but they do all the heavy lifting on these types of allegations. So the functions of the RIO are carried out by the Tulane Research Compliance Office, which again is Brian and Lisa. So there's provisions for an initial inquiry to determine if the allegations have merit. There's provisions for a formal investigation to determine the truth of the allegations. We have a designation of an individual authorized to adjudicate the conclusions of the investigation and impose administrative actions to redress misconduct and vindicate the person charged. And there are provisions for reporting the findings to ORI. So when a research misconduct case is concluded, that gets passed on to the NIH or the NSF, if necessary. So I don't know if any of you subscribe to this NIH emails yet, for those of you that work in biomedical sciences, but often in their emails that you get, they have to publish findings of research misconduct. They become part of the public record if it's NIH money. Your name is in the public for the rest of your life. You can type in Eric Pullman's name, that will be one of the first things that comes up. NIH finding statement, summary statement on his case, because it was involved in NIH money. That will never go away. That will follow you the rest of your life. So the Office of Research Integrity develops policies, procedures, and regulations related to the detection, investigation, and prevention of research misconduct and the responsible conduct of research. It reviews and monitors research misconduct investigations conducted by applicant and awardee institutions, intramural research programs, and the Office of Inspector General in the Department of Health and Human Services. It recommends research misconduct findings and administrative action. It also provides technical assistance to institutions to respond to allegations of research misconduct. So the institution has people they can ask questions of and get advice from. Implements activities and programs to teach responsible conduct of research, hence this course. Promote research integrity and prevent research misconduct. And believe it or not, it's not just students that take this course. As a new faculty member, I took this course many, many years ago. Conducts policies, analyses, evaluations, and research to build the knowledge base in research misconduct, research integrity, and prevention. So I've been giving this lecture now for, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. And I try to update it every year with new cases and new interesting cases. I did that, put a couple new ones in this year. Sadly, we don't have enough time because I could stand up here for hours and go through cases, sadly. Administers programs for maintaining institutional assurances, responding to allegations of retaliation against whistleblowers as well. So according to the Federal Office of Research Integrity, in general terms, the responsible conduct of research is good citizenship applied to professional life. Researchers who conduct and report their work honestly, accurately, efficiently, and objectively can achieve responsible conduct in research. What if you're writing a paper, you're a student, and you just happen to analyze the data incorrectly? Is that research misconduct? What do you think?
Was it purposeful?
No, if it's an honest mistake, it's not necessarily research misconduct. It might lead to a retraction of a paper, but that's not research misconduct. And I will say, as someone who's worked in this field for a long time, if you have published a paper and you realize, oh, I made a mistake or I mislabeled a graph, you should publish a correction. Many people don't, but you should publish a correction. Publishing a correction is not ever held against you. And if you find out that you did something that you should retract a paper for, even though it may not be research misconduct, you should retract your paper. Many people don't, but they should. So in terms of misconduct, the Office of Research Integrity expects that you adopt a zero tolerance policy, that you protect the whistleblowers, you clarify how to report, you train the mentors, and you model ethical behavior. So what is research misconduct? Defined as fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in the proposing, performing, or reviewing research results. So the important one to me is that initial one where it says proposing. Again, it doesn't have to be published. Be in a grant application. Could be in an unpublished paper. So it's fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism. So fabrication is just making up the data. And you'll have some data in here to show you it happens a lot. Falsification is distorting the data. So maybe removing outliers that don't fit your preconceived hypothesis. And then questionable research practices such as cooking the data, mining the data, concealing conflicts of interest. Those are all big issues. There have been a lot of cases in the past decade about conflicts of interest. People may have interest in a biotechnology company that they're collaborating with to do a clinical trial, and something goes wrong in the clinical trial. Well, they had a conflict of interest. That company should have never been allowed to collaborate with the PI who maybe was a founder of the biotechnology. That's a conflict of interest. So fabrication is making up results and recording or reporting them. Falsification is manipulation of research materials, equipment, or processes, or changing or omitting results such that the research is not accurately represented in the record. And then plagiarism is the appropriation of another's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving proper credit. I had a semi-funny story. A friend of mine was trying to publish a paper, and he had published a previous paper, and he got a notice back from the journal, we're interested in accepting your paper, but there are large chunks of this that are plagiarized. And he was shocked, of course. And he said, well, first of all, how do you know they're plagiarized? And believe it or not, these journals now have software that control the internet looking for similar terms and phrases. But essentially, they made him change his paper because he was plagiarizing himself. So one of the things that's a little bit absurd about all this is you can get to a point where, we all have specific ways that we write things or we phrase things. And to me, that's a bit of an absurd example where you can't even use the phraseology that you like to use to describe your system over and over again. So sometimes it gets a little carried away. But believe it or not, these journals have software that look for plagiarism. Let's see. So criteria for research misconduct, anything that represents a significant departure from accepted practices. And this is a key one, has been committed intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly. And then thirdly, can be proven by a preponderance of the evidence. So is that pretty clear? That really nails it down. Kind of have to meet those three criteria. The research misconduct does not include honest error, misinterpretation of the results, or differences of opinion. So you may publish a paper that flies in the face of tradition in your field. And you may get a lot of blowback from that. Doesn't mean it wasn't right. Doesn't mean it wasn't research misconduct. And again, we talked about honest error or misinterpretation of the results. As long as you didn't set out to knowingly do it, it's not necessarily research. Top bad behaviors. So here's a list of things not to do. Fabricating or cooking research data. Doesn't look quite as good as I'd like it to be. I'm not going to redo the experiment. I'll just add some more data points over here. Ignoring major aspects of human subject requirements. Sadly, that happens all too often where, when you do a human clinical trial, anybody in here do human clinical trials? But when you do a human clinical trial, there are specific criteria that your patients have to meet medically, and sometimes those get ignored and bad things can happen. There's a notorious case back in the late 80s, early 90s, where a person on a gene therapy clinical trial died as a result of getting the gene therapy, but when they did the investigation, it turns out clinically he should have never been allowed to go through with the procedure because medically he was not within the limitations of where he needed to be a clinically acceptable practice. Not properly disclosing involvement in firms whose products are based on one's own research. So again, it goes back to the collaborating with a biotechnology company that's using my technology. Of course, I want them to be successful, so I'll just make their data look a little bit more successful. Relationships with students, research subjects, or clients that may be interpreted as questionable. And then using others' ideas without obtaining permission or giving due credit, which is generally plagiarism. Although occasionally you do see misconduct cases where somebody was sitting around in a lab meeting, graduate student presented a piece of data, all of a sudden another faculty member is writing a grant with that piece of data in it that his or her lab had no involvement in generating. That's happened. Unauthorized use of confidential information in connections with one's own research. Failing to present data that contradicts one's own previous research. So if you publish a paper and you find out later with follow-up experiments that maybe that wasn't exactly right, you should acknowledge that at some point, maybe publish a correction. Overlooking others' use of flawed data or questionable interpretation of the data. Changing the design, methodology, or results of a study in response to pressure from a funding source. Publishing the same data or results in 2 or more publications. Believe it or not, that happens a lot. With all of these new small kind of journals that troll for papers, you'll be shocked at how many times you see the same data out there over and over and over. Because they don't think anybody's ever going to find out, or they don't think anybody's ever going to check. But this is happening more and more, where you see the same paper over and over and over again. So believe it or not, research misconduct has become such a focus and so predominant that somebody actually did an analysis and published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It's referenced down there if you want to read it. It's a few years old now. But misconduct accounts for the majority of retracted paper scientific publications. So essentially they went and analyzed the data, and this is what they saw. So if you look at the graph on the left, I don't know if you can see it, but the red line indicates fraud, suspected fraud. The blue line is error. The yellow line is plagiarism. And the green line is duplicate publication. So you can see from 2007 to 2011, the dramatic increase in fraud, suspected fraud, and the dramatic increase in plagiarism, and the dramatic increase in duplicate publications. And so if you look at the percent of articles that are retracted for fraud or suspected fraud, you can see it's on the upswing. And then they make these lovely pie charts looking at country of origin of all of these things. And it's the countries you, in many ways, expect it to be with the highest levels of scientific funding. USA is fraud or suspected fraud. We're the blue part of the pie in all of these, I believe. Plagiarism is over here, and then duplicate publications. Although duplicate publications has some very large offenders from overseas. And again, that's something that probably 15, 20 years ago, when the number of scientific journals was much more limited, almost never happened. But it's happening at an increasing rate and increasing frequency. So the paper is an interesting read. If you ever have some spare time, I would download it and read it. Examples of fabrication. So what do we mean by fabrication? Creating data for experiments that were never done. That's about the worst one you can do. Making up subjects, splicing together different images to represent a single experiment. Believe it or not, journals also have software now that can detect that in an image. So you might think, well, looks pretty good. I showed it to my boss. He couldn't tell. Journals actually have computer-based software that will look for that in the figures that you send them. You can change the brightness and or contrast of the image. Now, if you have a gel, I don't know how many do molecular biology research, but if you had a gel that had 15 lanes on it, and it contained every sample you wanted to publish, changing the brightness or contrast of that is less dramatic than, oh wait, these 4 lanes, I'd like them to look a little bit less intense because they're my control lanes and that gene wasn't meant to be expressed there, so I'll just lighten them up. That's a problem. Any change that conceals information even when it's considered not specific. So one of the things you often see on that is somebody will do a Western blot. Everybody knows what a Western blot is. You're detecting protein. A lot of those are fraught with ghost bands and other bands that aren't the right size. We've all done that, had that problem happen to us. Well, I'll just make it easy. I'll just Photoshop those out or cover them up and nobody will see them. The other thing that happens, and I don't know that it's as big a problem, but anybody in here does PCR, a lot of times you'll see the PCR gel published and it's just the band that they want you to see. You never get to see the whole gel anymore. So any change that conceals information is not good. Showing only a very small part of the photograph, so additional information is not visible. So I took a picture of 10,000 cells, but these 50 cells over here look really interesting and really show what I thought I'd see, so I'm just going to focus on those 50 cells. That's not good. So a lot of times journals now, if you want to have a high power magnification, they will make you include a low power magnification as well. Substituting one subject's record for that of another, that's primarily clinical research. Inflating the number of samples, animal subjects that were used. So as we all know, if you use animals, you're supposed to use a number that gives you statistically relevant data. 1, 2, or 3 is usually not that number. Well, I did it in 3 mice. I'll just duplicate it and say I did it in 6 mice. That's not good. Deleting data points, altering images to appear better, altering images and using them multiple times. That's not good. But why do people do this? Well, a lot of times they're under career pressure. They're a junior faculty member, just trying to start out and get tenure somewhere. They're a postdoc who's trying to get a faculty position somewhere. So, our field is driven by publish or perish. Get research dollars or don't get tenure. The desire to get ahead, character issues and or laziness, the ease at which it can be done now, everything's computer-based, so I don't have to take pictures. And when I was in graduate school, you literally had to go to the darkroom and take a picture of your gel. So you wanted to spend as little time in there as possible because it was a pain in the you-know-what. So you didn't waste hours making multiple images so I could splice together a figure. You went with what you got. Personal problems, cultural differences, and then there are, of course, things that we don't even know about because some people don't ever tell you why they did it. So if you look at retractions, this is from a New York Times article. The number of scientific retractions is on the rise. The graph on the right, again, kind of mimics what was in the PNAS paper, but this was for the general public's consumption. So essentially, the yellow is fraud or fabrication. The dark gray is scientific mistake, and the light gray is other. So things like fabrication or plagiarism. So let's talk about some real-world case studies. These events actually happened, and there were consequences. All right, so informed consent documents for a research study contained multiple places for a participant to sign. Audit of the study revealed that some of the signed informed consents, signatures on one part of the form did not match signatures on another part of the form. Some signatures appeared to be forged. Is that research misconduct?
Yes.
Everybody's saying yes, pretty good. Let's see. No. Why is it not? Anybody in here do clinical research? Anybody want to hazard a guess why it's not?
It's a human subjects violation, right? It's not necessarily, doesn't have anything to do with the data that you're producing. It's
Right.
more about the safety of the patient.
Right. So even though this was a non-compliance with federal regulations regarding informed consent, it was determined not to be a material failure to comply with federal regulations, nor did it constitute falsification of data or plagiarism. The matter was reported to appropriate federal agency as a serious non-compliance, but not as research misconduct.
There's like the form, there was not a question about whether the participants.
There were original signatures on there.
Right,
Yeah.
right, like question about whether
Right.
the subjects were made up or not. You know,
Correct.
like, it's just the form wasn't filled out correctly. And so
Correct.
if the participant in the research is real,
Yes.
you know, the informed consent document itself is not usually considered data.
Right. Correct. All right. Case number 2. A researcher admitted to 2 counts of making false statements in connection with a grant proposal and progress reports that contained false data. The result of rabbit sera that researcher intentionally spiked with human HIV antibodies to make it appear as if a vaccine was working. That research misconduct.
Yeah.
Right? So this is a real case. The researcher is a former research assistant professor at Iowa State University. After 1 year of investigation, that's the other thing I should point out, which Brian and Lisa would attest to. Once these investigations start, they can be very, very protracted. They can take years of time. So this one was a 1 year investigation, but the Office of Research Integrity and Dr. Hahn agreed to a settlement. This was in 2014. He admitted the research misconduct and agreed to a 3-year ban from receiving public health service funding. The senator from Iowa was very upset at the terms of the settlement agreement, and he actually brought a false claims action, and a settlement was reached for that. The university had to pay essentially $500,000 back to the NIH, cover this person's salary and benefits that had been paid with NIH funding. He then was represented by a public defender and agreed to pay $7.2 million to the NIH as restitution for NIH's actual losses due to Dr. Hahn's actions. And then on July 2015, he was sentenced to 57 months in prison. And I don't have an update on this, but he was going to appeal.
Oh, it was like
Was it? But did he actually spend time in prison?
he's,
In prison now?
Wow.
So, as,
I mean, the sentence was upheld. I'm not
okay,
doing the math from, you know, maybe.
right, he might be out by now, but he actually did go to prison.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on why do you think the senator was outraged at what ORI agreed to?
So they essentially said,
I mean,
all you're going to do is be banned from public health service funding for 3 years.
Like
It's stuff on
wasted
the- yeah.
probably millions of dollars of public funding,
Tax
and that's all he
funding.
got.
It was just sort of like a, you know, like you did something wrong,
Like
but
a
like,
slap on the
we
wrist.
still want you to do stuff for us eventually.
And he represents people
Yeah.
who are paying taxes,
Sure.
which eventually
Yeah.
go towards this funding. So maybe that's why he was outraged.
Yeah, all of you are correct. The senator thought that it was way too lenient, and so even when the university and our regulator, Office of Research Integrity, if we come to an agreement with the respondent about, you know, a case and what the ramifications are, there's still other levels above us that can intervene and overrule us. That's what happened.
And I will say, it appears to me that more often now, the governmental agencies that have funded this research or paid for this research are actually coming back with financial aspects to the punishment. It used to be, all right, you're not going to be able to get a grant for 3 years. And then the people would wait their 3 years and then go back and get another grant. But now it actually has jail time as well as financial punishment. All right. Graduate student includes falsified or fabricated data in 2 poster presentations, several laboratory meetings, and progress reports associated with federal grants. This one popped up on its own, but yes, that's research misconduct. This one is an interesting case. She was at the Wake Forest School of Medicine, and she was a graduate student, and she knowingly presented falsified or fabricated data in 2 poster presentations, several lab meetings, and progress reports to the NIH, National Institutes of Drug Abuse. She reported that 12 non-human primates responded to an anti-abuse nicotinic acetylcholine and or dopamine receptor selective compounds in self-selectivity assays for cocaine, methamphetamines, or nicotine when the compounds were never actually given to the primates for the protocol. So again, this is truly just making up the data as you go. He received 3 years of probation in 2015, and her probation called for supervision if she applies for or receives PHS funding support during her probation. I don't know how she would get that because I don't know who would hire her after this comes out as public knowledge, but maybe somebody did hire her. A lot of times these people when people started first doing these investigations and reporting research misconduct more seriously, a lot of times it was, like I said, 3 years and then they were back in business. A lot of universities now won't even take a look at you if you have a history of this in any way, shape, or form.
Was there any information about why the respondent did this?
No, a lot of times, or at least in the stories that come out, a lot of times they never get into the thought process of why. So a faculty member was developing personalized cancer treatments based on published results and performed human clinical trials based on falsified microarray data. Is this research misconduct? Yes, it is. This one is a really good one. So there's actually a 60-minute story on this one. So if you ever want to see the complete story, click on that link. You'll go to a YouTube story. His name was Anil Poti. He was at Duke University. And he sold that he had found kind of the holy grail for personalized cancer medicine. They would isolate some of your tumor. They would do genomic analysis on it. And based on that genomic analysis, they would design a treatment regimen that would be so effective that your tumor would be eliminated, that would work specifically for you and maybe not the patient right next. Turns out he was making all that up. So he also embellished his resume. He said he was a Rhodes Scholar when he really technically was not a Rhodes Scholar. This resulted in 27 papers being retracted and the termination of an ongoing clinical trial, thankfully. In the interview, you'll see that Duke feels like they didn't really do any, so this was all done at Duke University. From a clinical perspective, they feel they didn't do anything wrong because the patients were getting traditional standard of care in addition to this fancy genomic medicine. So they settled with Dr. Poti, and he was allowed to neither admit nor deny their findings of research misconduct. And his only real punishment was he had to have supervised research for 5 years, and the university had to repay the grants to the funding agency. But it was millions and millions of dollars. And if you look up Dr. Anil Poti, he is still practicing clinical oncology. He's now in the state of North Dakota, where he treats cancer patients. So no one's saying from a medical standpoint he's not a qualified physician, but he'll never do research. I can guarantee you that.
Do universities have insurance for these type of situations? Like in medicine, we have malpractice insurance.
And do we?
Is there
It's a good question.
Research insurance?
Yeah, so we have insurance that covers that in the case of a clinical trial like that things go wrong. Yes, but
like to repay NIH funds.
Now I don't know if we have insurance to repay NIH. So if there's
I've never heard anyone mention that at any university.
if there's like a participant in the research experiences like injury or other ill effects from the research, we would have insurance to cover that. But yeah, as far as that's a really great question, which also makes me a little worried. So I'm gonna follow up on that.
I've actually I've never heard of that at any university.
Yeah.
It's not.
So I will say if you are ever at a university, 60 Minutes comes up and wants to talk to you, you've done a really bad thing. I will say, watch that story because it really is, it really shows you the hubris of this person, that he thought he could lie and get away with this. And it turns out, as you get into the case a little more and read about it, if you want to read about it, there's plenty of stories published online too. The one mistake that Duke made is a few years before it got to this point, a graduate student in the lab said, things aren't right here. You need to look into this. And they kind of ignored that graduate student. So interesting case if you ever want to do some fun weekend reading about research misconduct. That's probably one of the best cases I have come across. And it's fairly recent as well. He obviously left Duke University and has moved on. So this one is a case about sabotage. Graduate student on graduate student sabotage. And believe it or not, this is research misconduct as well. So a graduate student at the University of Michigan suddenly has a series of experiments on her cancer research project go awry. Samples for a Western blot appeared to be mislabeled consistently, and her cell cultures died repeatedly. And when she started to investigate this on her own, found out that her media was spiked with ethanol. For those of you that grow cells, you know, very good way to kill off cells in a dish is hit them with any sort of alcohol. So when she took her assays to another lab, she went over to her fiance's lab around the corner. It was Nerd Love. And they worked, students worked just fine. I can say that because that's how my wife and she was in the lab. Maybe that should have been my fun fact. So she went to another lab, everything worked fine. In her own lab, everything failed miserably. So she went to the PI, took the matter. PI was resistant at first, but then took the matter to the university's Office of Regulatory Affairs. The officials came in and installed 2 security cameras in the lab and in the cold room, unbeknownst to anybody else in the lab. So you wouldn't have known they were there. And next week or sometime, she went in the lab, and of course, same thing had happened again. Nothing had worked, all her cells were dead. So of course, what do? They review the tape. They go to the tape, and they found about an hour before she came into work, postdoc in her lab went and essentially went into her refrigerator where her tissue culture media was kept. Now, they couldn't get him actually doing it on video, but he was in the refrigerator for a long period of time with a spray bottle of ethanol. So the university police showed up, took him to the university police station and started questioning him, and he caved in, of course, and said he did it. So he claimed he was from another country. He claimed he was under intense pressure to get ahead and be successful, and he didn't like the fact that she was being successful and maybe his experiments weren't going as quickly, so he decided he would just slow her down. In his mind, he thought that was perfectly acceptable. I'll just slow her down. She won't look as good to the boss. I won't look as bad to the boss, and everything will be okay. He was prosecuted. The judge sentenced him to repay $8,800 for reagents, $600 in court fees, and then got 6 months of probation and 40 hours of community service. However, the PI, who of course was very upset at this point, had prepared a detailed list of damages, including his salary for the entire time that he was doing this, half of the graduate student's salary, 6 months of the tech salary that she had to give the graduate student to get her caught up to where she should be because of all this sabotage, and laboratory reagents, which totaled up to $72,000. And the judge actually thought that was reasonable, and they ended up settling somewhere in between these two figures. This postdoc went back to his home country, and so he never saw any jail time or anything. He's back in his country, and I don't know what he's doing, but he has left the U.S.
If we have a research misconduct process, as Dr. Bunnell spoke about, normally the court would not be involved, but that's a good example that at any point someone could file a lawsuit.
Yes.
And that would be outside of our control.
Yes. So I think because the police department had gotten involved and essentially caught him on the surveillance cameras, they were involved at that point. So they took it forward. These cases there's this one, and then there was one other one at Yale that was somewhat similar to this. When I started to read them, I thought they were the same case, but these are fairly rare. Usually graduate student crime is not rise to this level. It's usually dealt with by the PI. Trust me, if that was in my lab and I knew you did it, you wouldn't work for me for very long. So these are kind of rare, but again, it is research misconduct and can be prosecuted, both within the university and obviously outside the university. So I thought that one was maybe somewhat more relevant to the younger people in the crowd who are just starting their graduate careers. All right, so the lessons learned from research misconduct cases, it can be anybody. It can be anybody involved in research can be responsible for misconduct, regardless of the rank or duties on the project. I really couldn't find any good ones, recent ones, where a technician had done something, but there have been cases along those lines. The majority of respondents have held technical positions and not doctoral degree holders. Common excuse for research misconduct is excessive workloads and/or time pressure. Scientific quote unquote divorces are often bitter and irrational. However, the accusations usually do not research misconduct. So one of the things that, I don't know if it's happened here at Tulane, but one of the things you often hear is, maybe a postdoc and a PI not working out. So the postdoc will leave and say, well, I'm going to take the whole place down with me and I'll just start making all these false accusations of research misconduct. That doesn't necessarily mean research misconduct is going on, but if a report is made, it's going to be investigated. It can degrade the university's reputation and result in a loss of public trust. And as we saw, there are physical, monetary, and psychological harm to employees, research subjects, students, and trainees. There can be additional regulatory oversight resulting in greater scrutiny, expanded programmatic requirements, and greater institutional investments. There can be suspension, disqualification of individual researchers. There could be fines, penalties, and punitive compensatory damages, debarment, and legal defense costs. So the research misconduct process at Tulane. So the policies are listed in the faculty handbook and on the Tulane Research Compliance website. So go to that website. I think it's still there and still valid.
We just got the upgrade.
Uh-oh.
But
you'll give them that information if they want to read about it?
Okay. But yeah, if you Google. And as far as the policies and procedures that we're required to have because we accept federal funding, the process is going to be fairly consistent between institutions because if an institution's taking federal funding to conduct research, they're going to have a process that meets the guidelines. Yes. So there might be some differences. Some institutions might consider more things than say are required by the regulations, but this process is not specific just to Tulane. It would be applicable to any university.
Yes. So if you are the person that discovers research misconduct, you can contact the research compliance officer for guidance, Brian and or Lisa. They will be more than happy to chat with you. You have the right to remain anonymous. You don't have to let them know who you are. And you are 100% protected from retaliatory act. So a lot of times, sadly, what will happen is something will happen and the PI will strike out at the person that actually contacted ORI instead of the person that actually did the research misconduct. And that's not allowed. If you are accused of research misconduct, you are entitled to due process. So you, as the accused, can contact the research compliance officer for guidance. The office is obligated to protect the confidentiality of the process. So in theory, no one knows that you've been accused other than yourself, the accusee, and Brian's office. So stages of the process, there's a submission of allegations, there's the assessment, there's sequestration and notification of the respondent of the allegations. Then there's the inquiry, investigation, formal finding, and appropriate disposition. So the investigation of research misconduct is a serious and lengthy process. As I said, many of these cases can go for years. They're not wrapped up in a month. They're not wrapped up in 6 months. Some have gone 3, 4, 5, 6 years before a conclusion is reached. Where possible, there's an attempt at an informal resolution by speaking with the supervisor or responsible academic officer, chair, dean, prior to submitting an allegation. And that happens in all cases. Or you try to have a informal resolution.
I think that, right, I mean, it does not happen in all cases, but that is
it's an opportunity in all cases.
Opportunity to speak with a trusted mentor or person about this.
Right. So if the research is involved PHS funding or NIH money or something like that, the PHS Office of Research Integrity has to be involved in the process. And as Brian said, there's always someone higher up. They can override the decisions of the university. So if the university went through this and said, it's not what we thought it was, there's really no research misconduct here, or I can say, well, we looked at what you sent us and we say there is, and they can inflict their own punishments.
Do our process over again.
Correct. Yes. So examples of disciplinary actions include a letter of reprimand, removal from a particular project, special monitoring of future work, suspension or expulsion of students, termination of employment, and or dismissal of a faculty member.
I'll say that it's considered very.
None of this is good. So disciplinary action by sponsors. So this would be something, say, NIH can do. Again, they could give you a letter of reprimand, restrict your expenditures under the award, suspension or termination of the award. I have not yet come across a case where they restricted the expenditures. It's usually a suspension or termination of the award. They can require a correction of the research record, which is why all those papers get retracted. They can prohibit you from serving as a reviewer, advisor, or consultant to any federal agency, and they can prohibit the individual and or institution from receiving federal funds. Usually it's the individual. I think it would have to be pretty rampant research misconduct to ban an institution from getting it. But as you saw in some of the cases we presented, individuals can be banned for periods of 3-5 years, for life. So any questions for me or Brian or Lisa? I'm happy to take any questions from anybody anywhere.
I'm just curious. Okay, so how often do you say, like, just regularly, like in your career, do y'all actually like encounter like reports of these like misconduct and it actually being legitimate like misconduct? Because it's just kind of hard for me to believe that like like a lot of people would just be out here doing that.
I'm going to let Brian and Lisa answer that one since that's their office's job.
So I would say it's how often do we receive? I mean, it's not something we get regularly. This is not that we are constantly receiving allegations, but we do. But sometimes they are, for example, hotlines used to file an allegation, and it's actually something that's really more animal welfare concern, a human subject concern. It's like sometimes it's not a long process, but when the allegations seem to have some merit, it takes a long time to complete the process. So does it happen a lot at Tulane? Thankfully, no, but it does happen. And
I will say, to be a authentic member of the scientific community, if you know it's happening or you think it's happening, you really need to reach out to these guys. Because part of the process is the system monitors itself and polices itself. And so if you know it's happening, it's kind of an inherent responsibility of you as a scientist to take action upon that. You'll be protected.
And this like affect, like say your PI does something and you're not necessarily involved in it, but could that eventually affect you in the future? Like people will maybe not trust your work because your PI has like a bad record?
That's a good question. I mean, I think kind of the public perception is if, say, a postdoc in your lab was found guilty of this and you were in the lab at the same time, I don't think people hold it against you. I think they would hold it against the person if that person applied for a job. I do think if this happens in a PI's lab a few times, then the PI starts to get looked at a little sideways. But no, I don't think anybody's going to hold it against you if you were not formally involved in any of the activities. They shouldn't. They might ask you about it, but they shouldn't hold it against you.
Well, when I was thinking after you asked the question, even though, as Dr. Bunnell emphasized, publication doesn't matter whether or not it's research conduct, but it is a case where if members of the lab are co-authors on a publication, the PI is the corresponding author, lead author, and then it has to be retracted because research misconduct, and the lab members are co-authors, then that's something that will then is now a part of the public record.
And if a paper is retracted, you do need to take it off your CV. It no longer exists. So Brian brings up a good point with that, because my wife was involved in a case at the University of Michigan where she was he's now the director of the NIH, Francis Collins. She was in Francis Collins' lab, and a graduate student was found to have made up data that was in 3 or 4 papers that she was a co-author on, and all of those got retracted. And again, it was never held against her or any of the other authors, but everybody always asks her about it, I'll tell you that much. And they do have to come off of your CV if they are retracted, because they're no longer official publications. Any other questions?
Well, that's a good point. Maybe like if this would happen to one of us, that I guess you have to be prepared to answer the question if asked.
You do, because it will, again, the person that I was talking about in terms of the clinical trial where the patient died, name's Jim Wilson. You can look him up too. I worked for him before he became infamous, is what I tell people. I was a postdoc with him at the University of Michigan, and when people find out I work for him, that's all they want to talk. So if you're ever involved in a environment where this happened, you'll get asked about it the rest of your life, if it's a famous enough case.
And as far as like the frequency of happening, I think that our researchers, in general, have now are used to the idea that their work, which is available online, is scrutinized, and that's very easy to run an image through PowerPoint or other programs and see how it may have been manipulated, and then that could be filed anonymously with either the PI's institution or with the Office of Research Integrity, and that happened a lot once it became very easy to analyze images. So I hope that now leads to less.
In my opinion, one of the kind of the last holdouts is this belief that, well, if it's not in the paper, it's not misconduct. I hear people tell me that all the time. People in my generation and older. Well, I didn't publish it, so it's not misconduct. That's not true. And I hope today we showed you that that's not true.
So if you're all curious about this topic in general, there's a website called Retraction Watch.
Yes.
Some of you have read it. Okay. So if you haven't read it, I encourage you to check it out.
I'll send you a daily email.
You can sign up for their newsletter. I get it in my inbox every day, and they track retractions all over the world. They have a new database that you can put in anybody or any institution's name and see what retractions have happened.
And the reason I say that this will follow you for the rest of your life is that reason right there. The Retraction Watch tracks them all, whether they're NIH funded, PHS funded, or not. Your name will be Googled forever. That will come up every time your name is Googled. So a serious accusation and a serious finding against you, again, will ruin your career. So just don't do it. Trust me. I've seen people suffer, so just don't do it.
And one more thing I just want to add. One of the reasons that these matters take so long once they get started is because a very thorough, in-depth look is taken. So just because someone makes an allegation, that doesn't mean that the person who's accused is going to be found to have committed the research misconduct. So we make every effort to look at every piece of information, talk to witnesses, look at all the data to make sure that whatever the outcome is accurate. So that is one reason that it takes so long.
And trust me, I've been in laboratories where you go have your weekly or monthly meeting with your PI, and he or she's like, where's the data, where's the data, where's the data? Or you go in with your result and they say, that's not how it should look. Don't give in to the temptation. Don't give them what you think they want to see. That's research. Stick to your principles. Educate them on why it doesn't look the way they thought it should look. And never ever work for somebody that says, well, your data should look like this. Because I've been in those labs, and miraculously, students will give them data that looks like it. But trust me, the more interesting data is the stuff that doesn't fit their preconceived notion. If everything worked the way we expected it to work, we wouldn't have to have research. We could just predict the way it would work. And trust me, the most exciting projects in my lab are the offshoots of the stuff we thought was going to be very straightforward. So take a look at those outliers. Take a look at the things that don't fit your preconceived notion, because that's where the cool stuff is, in my opinion. Any other questions? If not, I think we're
at time, but if anyone wants to stay and ask any other questions, feel free.
Thank you, Dr. Bunnell.